Everyone, my name is Gregor Muir. I'm the director of the ICA. Welcome to you all, and thank you for coming to this evening's talk. I'd very much like to welcome our guests this evening. First of all, I point to Glenn Adamson, who will be chairing, and Glenn is Deputy Head of Research and Head of Graduate Studies at the V&A Museum, where he leads a graduate program in History of Design. His research interests include modern craft and design furniture and ceramics in England and America in the 17th and 18th centuries, and decorative arts theory. Also very interestingly, and at the moment, Glenn is the co-curator of the forthcoming V&A exhibition, Postmodernism, Style and Subversion exhibition, which will be opening on the 24th of September. Thank you. I'd also like to welcome Sam Jacob, Grayson Perry, and Charles Jencks. I just make a quick promotion for three things. One is Charles Jencks's book, which has just come out today, so if you see these little leaflets, that's what that's in relation to. I'd also like to make a pitch for Pablo Bronstein's beautiful little book on postmodernism in London. And finally, there are posters abounding all over the place which relate to our forthcoming Jack Smith season, which opens next Wednesday. The Jack Smith season, as with this talk, are both in relation to Pablo Bronstein's exhibition. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gregor. As he said, my name is Glenn Adamson. I'm from the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I'm just going to introduce our panelists first, and each of them will speak for about 10 minutes. And then we'll have a bit of discussion about our theme, which is what is the use of ornament today. I think ornament is a great subject from my perspective to take up because obviously it is intrinsic to the subject of postmodernism, what I've been thinking about for the last little while. And each of our panelists have their own reason to think about the subject as well. Obviously, it's a subject that was once anathema to advanced art, as defined by modernism and the avant-garde earlier in the 20th century. But we've seen many, many returns of ornament, postmodernism being one example, feminism obviously being another very significant one, and then arguably lots of other different kinds of retrieval of this once disdained category in contemporary practice, ranging from the crafts to architecture to design, graphics, and so on. And so I'm hoping that our conversation will be rather wide-ranging across all of those disciplines, but will also get us to some of the aesthetic and social questions that attach to the question of ornament. So our panel, very distinguished, from my right, far right, Sam Jacob, founding director of FAT, Fashion Architecture Taste, who is an architect, writer, and critic. He is a teacher as well, so professor at UIC, also at the Architectural Association, and also a very frequent writer on the subject of architecture. He keeps a blog at strangeharvest.com, contributes to magazines and journals including Icon, Art Review, Frieze, Metropolis, and Architect's Journal, and of course is a practicing architect himself. So among his recent completed projects are the BBC Media Village in Cardiff, the International School in Birmingham, and residential schemes elsewhere in Britain, and also a new art academy in Eindhoven. Sam, also very excitingly, is collaborating with Grayson Perry, immediately to my right. Grayson will be known to many of you as the winner of the 2003 Turner Prize, but of course has had an amazing and wide-ranging career since then. Seems a long time ago now. Major solo exhibitions at the Musée d'Art Moderne in Luxembourg, the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, the Barbican here in London, and the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. And he's also a curator, as well as an artist. And among his previous exhibitions was Unpopular Culture at the De Loire Pavilion. But as I hope you all know, he has an upcoming exhibition at the British Museum entitled The Tomb of the Unknown Craftsman, which opens on October 6th. Finally, Charles Jencks in the middle, who will be our first speaker. It's always funny for me to introduce Charles Jencks because I feel like he invented the subject that I've been curating for the past 4 years. So Charles is perhaps best known for coining the term postmodernism in his book, The Language of Postmodern Architecture in 1977, but was already writing important influential work on architectural theory and design theory a full decade before that. including publications such as Meaning and Architecture from 1969, and one of my favorite books, Ad Hocism from 1972, which is about bricolage and making do in various circumstances. And since then, he's been an astonishingly prolific writer, many books, articles on late neo-postmodern architecture. Most recently, this book, which Gregor mentioned, The Story of Postmodernism, which is fresh out, can almost smell the ink on this copy. So Charles is going to start us off with 10 minutes on his version of what the use of contemporary ornament might be. Charles, over to you.
Thanks, Glenn. Thank you. Can you hear all right? I know there's a kind of void up here in the front row, but luckily no one's here except you. It's strange, isn't it? That, my talk is Postmodern Ornament is Not Kitsch, inspired by Glenn's catalog essay by, I think her name is Patricia
Morton. Yeah.
Morton, yeah, who attacks Charles Moore's building as kitsch, the Piazza d'Italia. So I will rise to Glenn's question and asking to be polemical as well as brief and sharp, and try to race through ideas in 10 minutes if possible. I must say it's probably the last surviving member of the postmodern movement. I'm a living fossil, probably. And also, I should say, critical still of modernism. So the polemic will be critical of modernism, particularly this diagram you see. Let me just reach in my pocket for my gun. If I can find it. It's Alfred Barr's famous diagram of 1935-36 for the Museum of Modern Art, and it established the, I don't want to put out your eyes, Grayson, if you could just pull back so I don't blind you with my laser. If you look at the diagram here, it's the most famous diagram of the 20th century. It established the layout of the Museum of Modern Art and the argument for modernism, as well as the Cubist art it was justifying. And you can see that it has several questionable aspects. Of course, it is, behind it all is the zeitgeist, the idea that there's a progressive movement in the arts and culture based on modernization. It's leading in an unhaltable way towards ever-accelerating change and progress. So all these arrows of the zeitgeist are pointing at various places, mostly Cubism, but they all end in the square box. You should be warned about squares right away in taste. Modern architecture, the Bauhaus. That's where it all culminates and ends. The demon of history marches on, the zeitgeist goes there. Well, that's one of its philosophical problems. You can only have to think of Popper and Gombrich to know that. Anyway, the other great problem, and I'm sure it is for everybody here, is that modernism is defined as non-geometrical abstract art. And so it's abstract expressionism, it's abstract Dadaism, it's abstract surrealism. It's modernism without content. Think about it. Alfred Barr did the stripping, the asset stripping, and the Museum of Modern Art bought it. And from then on, there was no content or figuration or subject matter or all the things that Clement Greenberg summarized in his epical attack of 1939 called Avant-Garde and Kitsch, where he put on the one side avant-garde abstraction and on the other side Mussolini, Franco, Hitler, and Stalin. They were all kitsch, and of course kitsch was what you had to fight from the beginning. He published that in the Partisan Review. Anyway, you could have asked any number of Dadists who then were collected by the MoMA whether they believed in abstraction and no content, and you'd get a very sharp answer right in the face. I won't dwell on that, but the zeitgeist did catch on, and kitsch from then on was used almost as a reflex against any art or architecture that was representational. More architecture than art. Representation snuck back quite soon, and multiple tastes were accepted quite soon, but not in modern architecture. I studied under Gropius, and we were all censored from any literary, symbolic, or reference in architecture. Anyway, you all know this building very well. It's the most important example of postmodern ornament, 1977-84. It's Stuttgart by James Sterling and Michael Wilford, the Near East Staatsgallery, and it's clearly use of ornament in an inverted way, using high-tech red and blue railings to tell you how to get through the building, not as functional Pompidou things to hold the building up, and a green undulating hyperbolic paraboloid to signify the interior entrance. So ironically, as well as the drop-off point there for taxis. So the blue and red, the color and the ornament is inverted in an ironic way to signal how to walk through the building, while a classical banded rustication is used to provide heating and cooling cycles that aren't disrupted, and to refer to this context of a classical museum to which it was adding. And also a vernacular was used as to relate to the vernacular up the hill. It's designed very much as a contextual building going up the hill. And in back, because Stuttgart 1929 was where modernism triumphed, there's modernist buildings as well as the Pompidou. So it has 6 different styles, a very radically eclectic building. All of the styles are used in an ironic way and inverted in their use. It's not kitsch because each one of these elements has a function, a structure, a construction, an understanding, and in a very interesting way relating to the multiple tastes, as Lyotard defined postmodernism, multiple language games. It was Jim's most popular building, and you see here the young crowded around him getting his autograph and asking him, how did you do this Pompidou Center? So to their codes, it was Richard Rogers, high-tech, to plein air painters, and it was Schinkel. It divided up a complex postmodern culture into its language groups and spoke to each of them. One of the keys is the ruin that fell off the side of the building. You can see it here, which is like an 18th century ruin of the building. The stones were rhetorically falling off the building. The thing is that you could go to these stones and look and see the real construction, which is only 1 inch deep. And that's why you should sit on the stones and contemplate the interior of the garage and the structure that's holding it up. And this led to, this was clearly a demonstrazione, a demonstration of how you do ornament and classicism and eclecticism in contemporary society of mixed groups. So its function then, when Jim was asked, why did you have a ruin, an 18th century ruin? He said, because the planners said we had to aerate the garage and there wasn't enough aeration going through the pumping system, so I broke a hole in the wall, punched it through. So there are many reasons for this, and that's what makes it non-kitsch postmodernism. Let me just say that Umberto Eco defined postmodernism in a famous way about how you say, I love you in an age of lost innocence. I'll read this because it's really important, and Jim Sterling loved this as the justification of his building, of the Sterling building, the Stuttgart building. He said, Umberto Eco, I think of the postmodern attitude as that of a man who loves a very cultivated woman and knows he cannot say to her, I love you madly, because he knows that she knows, and that she knows that he knows, that these words have already been written by Barbara Cartland. Still, there is a solution. He can say, quote, as Barbara Cartland would put it, I love you madly. At this point, having avoided false innocence, having said clearly that it is no longer possible to speak innocently, he will nevertheless have said what he wanted to say to the woman he loves, that he loves her, but he loves her in an age of lost innocence. If the woman goes along with this, she will have received a declaration of love all the same. Neither of the two speakers will feel innocent. Both will have accepted the challenge of the past and the already said, which cannot be eliminated. Both will consciously and with pleasure play the game of irony, but both will have succeeded once again in speaking of love. Well, Jim loved that as a description of this building and its fallen stones. Now, take this postmodern example that Paul Goldberg and others thought was a postmodern building. I would argue it is closer to kitsch than a postmodernism, and It's, of course, the AT&T building, 1978, with a Chippendale Highboy and a Pozzi Chapel front of Alberti and a lot of boredom in between. But it was much more interesting than all the flat-top buildings around it in the rest of the world, so it became the biggest media event of 1978. If you look at it under construction, where I photographed it to show the lack of irony, lack of understanding of postmodernism, you can see that it isn't a postmodern building, because here it's braced with these wonderful Roman cross braces, or contemporary steel cross braces. The Pozzi Chapel front, which he's plugged on and was going to have a hanging, keystone, is all of that is disguised. In other words, behind the building, like Stirling's building, is one of the most interesting structures on which a false classical front is put. But there's no irony there. There's no connection. There's no raising of consciousness. There's no having it both ways. There's not, I know that you know that I know. It's all, in a sense, a phony. And in that sense, Greenberg was attacking kitsch. Now, this building has been called kitsch in Glenn's catalog, postmodern kitsch. And it's it's the Piazza d'Italia by Charles Moore. And it's in a sea of very tall, black and white, monster modern buildings. I say monsters because there's no, they're just rip-off rent slab modernism. There's no culture behind it, and it's a desolate area. And it's in New Orleans, this context, and designed in 1974, 75, finished in 1976 by Charles Moore and others. And it was designed for the Italian community. Hence, it has 5, not 3 orders. The Sicilian community, this Italian community in New Orleans, which had no respect in the community. They were lower than blacks in a sense, and they were looking for identity. This is a typical postmodern identity political motive. And so Moore, in talking with them and participating with them, understood their tastes and codes, and he gave them this very ironic rendition. But he provided also a context for it. The Piazza d'Italia is there, but the context around it is really giving a contrast to this heart and taking these 2 modern skyscrapers and embedding them in a tissue, in an urban tissue. So bringing back a kind of inside and outside an urban room and a location for a heartless city destroyed by modernization. Well, this building was attacked by a lot of people at the time as being outrageous, as being phony, as being condescending, as being kitsch. And I show you, it made the cover, nevertheless, of Progressive Architecture, and it has the 5 orders, but where the restaurant was to be is the delicatessen order rather than the Corinthian order. The other 4 are made out of water elements, and you can see how each of the classical orders is both defamiliarized, transformed, and turned into a piece of abstract sculpture. Here's one of the Serlian motifs with the stainless steel columns and busts of Moore himself, with water spouting out of his mouth, as the modernists said, puking water out of his mouth. They were so angry and outraged. Look at the beautiful way that the cross-section of a plinth is made, and you'll see, as Gibbs in the other room, you'll see how this move is being revived. So the building, the Piazza d'Italia, actually, the surrounding context wasn't built. The building fell after 5 years into disrepair, and it became a kind of postmodern ruin. It has been rebuilt, so it's a postmodern, Mary Hartman. It's a building which is postmodern and ironic in all of its use of water and the orders, but in order to root the Italian community, who are below the Anglos, the Anglo community, behind the Spanish community, behind the blacks and behind others. They're very much a minority. And this was designed for St. Joseph's Day festival, when the Sicilians come in New Orleans and celebrate. And here you see it, a picture not published, by the way, in any of these modernist attacks. And you see it filling up, and you see the irony of it being an abstract set of forms. If you look the other way, why don't the modernists look the other way? Backwards, forwards. Anyway, I want to end with a quick look at contemporary postmodern ornament, not of the kind of FAT and Grayson you'll see tonight. I think it's a kind of postmodernism that comes out of an intense referentiality to an ornament itself, and rotation. In this case, is John Lewis department store, designed by FOA, with these amazing rotational panels based on the lacework that John Lewis in the 19th century was made in Leicester, where it's from. A building I think even maybe more successful is FOA's Ravensbourne College, right next to the O2 Dome, Richard Rogers. And it has an amazing fractal quality also of elements which are basically these fractal Penrose tiling patterns that never exactly repeat. So it's innovating in all sorts of ways, in a very voluptuous way, in a very humorous way. If you look closely at these 7 or 8 different circles, you'll find that, like Sterling's ornament, the perfect ornament is inflected and comes out where it has to over the windows. So you can see actually the cross-section of what it's made, and it protrudes in a zigzag way to tell the difference between truth and falsity. There is one of those bigger windows where you see the reality of the ornament only being 2 inches deep. There you see the fractal pattern of 6 in a star shape rotating round, either as a void as a circle, and always changing. Actually, it was Penrose, Roger Penrose, the most famous living British scientist, who invented a pattern, the Penrose pattern famously, which is we find behind quasi crystals, which was partly behind this work, and this is why they misnamed the street Penrose Way. Actually, it's not a Penrose panel, as it turns out, Penrose fractal, but it's another one that FOA made. So it shows you postmodern ornament in its second incarnation. It's also like Sterling's ironic and truth-telling as it, through its lies, it's enjoying its exotic transformation of a pattern throughout, which relates, by the way, to the networking hot desking that goes on inside this building, so it even has a kind of iconological relationship. And in that sense, in the senses I've been saying, postmodern ornament is not kitsch, or else it's not postmodern.
Okay.
All right. Now we've got to see how I can work the future. Hang on. I thought the question was, what use is decoration? That's what I'm wondering. What do you think that is, Charles?
That's a whole nother question, isn't it?
But that's what we're here, that's what I thought we were here to answer.
Okay, no, let's talk about it. Let's talk about decoration.
No, I'm just,
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
He asked me for a polemic.
Oh, okay.
I had to do what he says. I do
Right.
whatever Glenn says.
Okay.
Yeah, very obedient.
Hang on, I'll just find my notes. I'm more shambolic than Charles. Here's an example of my work. It's obvious why, in some ways, why I've been asked to talk about what use is decoration. I think, but just the question itself actually is quite interesting. The word use, it implies that decoration has a use, which it may well have, but it's a word I want to talk about in some ways, is use. I've always had a relationship with ornament in that when I was at college, decoration was a real swear word. It was it was like precious, already the kind of the tide of intellectualism was starting to get up in the art world, and what in America they call the MFication of art, in that too many. If you think about the art world nowadays, it's sort of ruled by writers, which is a bit sad in some ways. People with ideas and intellectuals tend to be the people in power, the people who run the galleries and write the magazines and the reviews. So it's often art is given more weight if it's got ideas in it and it's understandable by those kind of people that didn't make it. So I've never always been a little bit against that. I suppose I've always wanted it to have what I call taxi driver appeal. You know, because there's a lot of work in that, they'll say, a lot of man hours, and it's quite old-fashioned, sort of simplistic, popular, middle-brow type of value. There's a word, middle-brow. Ooh, that's a frightening word. John Lewis does very well on it. I've always had what you call horror vacui. You know, I don't like an empty space. I can't really handle it. I always think of that sort of poor woman in that marvellous TV series, Sign of the Times, whose architect husband wouldn't let her have curtains. And so she used to go around her daughters just to be near curtains. And so I want to say, what's wrong with decoration in a way? Because I suppose that, you know, I've always had this, there is, again, you know, this is what we're here to talk about, I suppose, is the kind of pure modernists. And this is the Wieserkirche in Bavaria, probably one of the most famous sort of Rococo buildings in the world. You know, I cried when I went into this building. It's absolutely brilliant. It is an emotional hit of a building. It's like I felt like a fish swimming into God's coral reef when I went into this building. It's the most amazingly powerful emotional experience. I didn't have to understand it. I didn't worry about the bloody ideas in it. It was lovely colours and patterns, and it operated on me on a bodily way. It shook me when I saw it, because it was such a beautiful building. And so I'm not going to intellectualise about it. I'm not going to worry about the sadness of the excessively logical, because I think there's a loneliness about people that are desperate to understand everything. Because we're all equipped with this horrible kind of almost fascistic part of our brain that Steven Pinker calls the baloney generator, that desperately wants us to understand the world, desperately, because it doesn't understand it. It hates illogical things. It hates our feelings. It almost hates us. And so I don't want to kind of get too intellectual about it in the way that, I see a building and it just buzzes with me. It's just musical. And these are just buildings that I've photographed on my travels. You know, that's Reims Cathedral, Rouen Cathedral, and that's the mesquite in Cordoba. And for me, the use of decoration, for me, it tells stories, and we are all about stories. That's a big point of it. Is that what keeps us sane is understanding why we live and how we live. But I just wanted to talk about. This reminds me about Adolf Loos. Is it Adolf Loos who made the famous comment? "Ornament is crime," he said, and what he was partly referring to was the criminal's love of the tattoo. Now, I'm not saying this woman's a criminal, but. I've always kind of been on the side of the ornament, and men, they often. I want to sort of skew this into sort of gendered argument, I suppose. But it's a shame that we haven't got a woman up here on the stage, because I suppose I'll have to stand up for the kind of female argument in this case. Is that men often, there's a feminist phrase from the 70s. It was, "Objectivity is male subjectivity," which I thought was a very telling thing. Men, a lot of the time, I'm not putting these men in that bracket. These are very sophisticated, sensitive men. That's fine, but men often cloak their love of ornament and decoration behind function. You know, form follows function, and this watch is a good example of it. You know, who needs a bloody watch nowadays? Nobody uses a watch, but you know. The watch thing is becoming fetishistic now, and the more functions and the more high tech it is. And it's like, but all they really want is something knobbly on their wrist that's got lots of bobbles on it. And but they can't have something that's pink and diamondy. No, they have to have something that's macho and functional. Men love an epaulette, don't they? And if you think of pink and blue in gender, that it's pink for girls and blue for boys. I don't think it's blue for boys. I think it's camo for boys. Because I think because men, if you look now, what's the default sort of fabric of a male garment, especially with boys, because they're, the young kids, they're much more gendered in some ways. They're being policed much more heavily by their peers. I mean, this, by the way, if you don't know what it is a male chastity device available on the internet, but you can get it in camo, which I thought was very telling. And so I suppose I would put an argument that the idea that decoration has to have a use is a very kind of male argument in a way, and a bit of a hangover from people who are desperate to understand the world and to box it away because they're maybe a little bit frightened of woolly feelings because they're all girly and they don't understand it. And this pot that I made was called Barbaric Splendor, and it makes a reference to a quotation of a Greek orator, and they were very against the idea that of flowery language. They thought language should be very straightforward and plain, and they sneered at people who used a lot of elaborate phrasing, and they sneered at the more Eastern Oriental sensual cultures who indulged in their physical and emotional pleasures. And that's what they called it. They called it barbaric splendor. And I think that we often do that within the class system. And of course, I bet you bottom dollar that most people who are kind of pure modernists are middle class, because often there's a kind of moral element that is kind of stuck onto it. And the middle classes are world beaters at the slippage between the aesthetic and the moral. And if someone has bad taste and is kitsch and decorative, therefore they are bad people for having that. And I say, no, they're not. They just got different taste. Deal with it. You might have a lovely, clean Le Corbusier house, but some people like wallpaper and swirly carpets. I did this pot years ago now. It's called Boring Cool People. People who want... it's one of the most empty pots I ever made. This is Neuschwanstein in Bavaria, the castle you see in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, the famous Ludwig's castle. And so I put this in really to say, not all very decorative buildings are good. It's pretty hideous, actually. It's a hollow, horrible thing. And if anybody, it's like a poor man's St Pancras station inside. It's vile. His other place, Schloss Linderhof, is more interesting. But, I rejoice in this is just a little butcher shop that I saw in France, just some little tiles. I just rejoice in the delight and the silliness. It's a bit kind of, it reminded me of a kind of butcher. You probably saw Picasso's Guernica and thought, yeah, I'll get some tiles in that style. And I think, I put this is the Brandhorst Museum in Munich. I visited there, that's me on my motorbike just outside there. Which is much more ornate than the bloody museum that just looks like a Paul Smith carrier bag. And I think one of the biggest mistakes in taste about modern decoration is its timidity. And I think one of the big unspoken aspects of bad taste is timidity. It's like people, I was talking about a cool hunter the other day. I was making a TV series, and they were looking at some very extreme, fashionable people they'd seen on the street. And I said, well, how does that get down in the end to the Marks and Spencers? How does those trends end up? And this is what happens when the idea of decoration gets down to Marks and Spencers, is you end up with things like this. A few coloured blobs that somehow are meant to excuse an ordinary block of flats. And if you go around London now, it's like a blight, the coloured panel or the bit of wood stuck on the side of the flat that somehow is meant to tell me that, I don't know what it's meant to tell me. They recycle? What does it tell me? I don't know. I just find it hideous. It's timidity I find vile. End of. Do you want to sit here?
I think maybe I'm okay, actually. F5. How's that? Can you hear me? Am I too far from the mic? I also want to talk about Adolf Loos, because I think it's interesting, and especially that idea of the aesthetic relationship to morality, or the linkage of the two. And in one way, we were talking a little bit before, like whether modernism still exists, and certainly in architecture, modernism's ghost, the kind of neo-modern, is incredibly strong. So still, ideas of ornament and decoration are thought of as retrogressive, perhaps, or they're the thing. Decoration and ornament was a thing which was defeated. And it's also important to remember that Adolf Loos did describe it as a crime, which is quite something to say. So decoration and ornament, according to mainstream architecture, is effete, useless, probably, redundant. More than that, it's morally wrong, and it's degenerate, and it's criminal, like the tattooed prisoner, and it's perverted, which is, of course, why we like using it. But I think there's something more than that. Of course, there's one thing, which is to say, okay, this is an opposition to the kind of boring, kind of reduced aesthetic of neo-modernism, which even now has lost its polemic, its original kind of early 20th century polemic. And now it's simply an aesthetic which is applied with a panel, with a piece of wood, or so on. But I think there's more to it than simply opposition. I think ornament and decoration are ways in which architecture and design communicate. They're the kind of way in which it interfaces with the world, with things which are completely un-architectural, like people, like society, and like issues. Taste, for example, the way in which taste is actually not a visual construct, but a political construct. But first of all, I'd like to show just a kind of a way in which a piece of architecture becomes decoration. So this is a story about half timbering, which originates as a real kind of construction, pieces of wood and infilled panels, which was vernacular. It was made out of the stuff which existed in that locality. So originating somewhere, maybe in Saxony, I think. It's imported to Britain by Germanic mercenaries who are employed by the Roman Empire. And they start building half-timbered buildings here. So even 2,000 years ago, this half-timbering is already kind of nostalgic. It's already about something which has vanished, something which is gone. And as we see, a real structural system, a vernacular, kind of moving forward through history. Here we see it in the Elizabethan era, where it becomes incredibly extravagant. It becomes a kind of art spectacular, linked, of course, to the technology which is making Britain powerful and building its navy and so on. Or here, half-timbering revived in the arts and crafts as a kind of radical rejection of industrialization. Or here, in the interwar growth of suburbia, where suddenly the switch of it, although it's been used as image before, now it's non-structural. It's just applied to the outside of the building as a way of conjuring up the figure of history. Or here it becomes exported. Here it is in Beverly Hills. And here it is in Reading. The most beautiful thing, the way in which the drain pipe gets kind of drawn into this, this half-timbering. So it also becomes the generic symbol of like history as well. This is from the Department of Transport's Book of Signs. So you can see something which originates in a kind of modernist sense of structure, of material, of location. Over time, kind of cuts all of those connections, and it becomes part of culture. And this was a project that we did, which was kind of, in a way, to sort of end the story. First of all, because mock Tudor is the anathema to modernism and to neo-modernism. This is half-timbering mock Tudor as an alphabet. It's made into a font that you can type stuff into. So, of course, it's saying that architectural decoration is nothing to do with structure, it's to do with communication. And here it's pure communication. It's not holding anything up. Here it's just some pixels, or it might be a little bit of ink, but it's applied. So that decoration itself can be a way of kind of coding, essentially. So here, the object and the pattern have some disjunction, and when they come together, they form something else.
He didn't know I was going to talk about camo.
This is Homeland Security, Grayson. Another way we can think of it is that it's communications. This is, inverting Le Corbusier's phrase. This is a house as information for living, and that the decorative is a way of kind of essentially conjuring up the image of house, here made in neon. When these ideas, I think, are applied in architecture, I'm just going to show some of our work now. I think it's to do with, certainly in this case, it's about amplifying architecture's communicative power. So this is a project for an office and a house, and it kind of says exactly what it is. But it does it in a way where it is very explicit that this is decoration. So you can see the gap between the accommodation and the thing which is saying what it is. So in the same way that Charles was talking about this kind of visibility. And the gap then becomes expressed. So this is behind the billboard, you find the accommodation, and there's some kind of space that emerges in between. In a sense, that's quite rhetorical. This is a project for some social housing, where we were working very closely with a group of residents that we were rehousing, basically. So one of the things that we were interested in was trying to understand what the idea of house, what the idea of domesticity was that they were interested in. The project was, for us, a kind of negotiation between them as a very tight-knit northern working class community and the aspirations of kind of Blairite's regeneration, which is glossy neo-modernism. And so that tension seemed to us to be kind of interesting and essentially a big conflict. When we went to visit the residents, we found interiors like this, which are just amazingly beautiful, complicated, the kinds of things which if you've been trained, if you've been to architecture school, you would never be able to summon up half-timbering adobe huts and whatever else might be present here. But of course, we're understanding this not just as a visual phenomenon, but as a kind of cultural phenomenon. It's something which is communicating. It's something about identity, for sure. Of course, ingenuity as well. So the project, as built, is a kind of negotiation between the kind of image of the modern, but also this idea of the kind of cultural vision of what domesticity is. So it's built with bricks, for example. There's no fancy materials, there's no fancy engineering. It uses very familiar kind of brick patterns, but the ways in which these things are used is overscaled, cut up, so it has a kind of avant-gardeness to it. So you can see again the difference between the facade and the accommodation behind it. Or another case, this is an art school in Holland, which is in the middle of a parade, a religious parade between a castle and a cathedral. So you can see it there in the middle. The school also had its origins as a religious painting school. But this was a refurbishment project. So what we were trying to do here was use decoration as a kind of way of reconfiguring, first of all, the whole campus, but also allowing the decoration to begin to engage the school in this much bigger urban kind of scenario, and also to talk about its own heritage. Here the decoration is derived basically from a book about Gothic architecture, which we scanned in and manipulated and so on, and it was then made in a very high-tech way using computer-cut molds and casting it in super sharp-edged concrete. And in another project, we're in Rotterdam now, in a kind of suburb of Rotterdam, which looks like this, a classic 1950s new town next to a large oil refinery. And the first things we were doing was looking at, I guess, the difference between the image of this modernist suburb and the way it had been occupied. So you see here somebody somehow has jacked in a carriage lamp into the municipal power supply. Or you see here a front garden, which is, through the most kind of ordinary things, by going to the, B&Q on a bank holiday, has assembled something which is actually an incredibly rich document which talks about the history of the place, this person's life, their interests, and so on. And we think this, in some ways, is a very sophisticated kind of architecture and design, and something that we should learn from, especially when you're working within a place. So this is the scope of the project, a park and a series of buildings. And this is the centerpiece, which is a generic kind of shed, basically, something you can order from a mail order catalogue, pretty much. But it's then wrapped in a highly decorative language which talks completely about the landscape that surrounds it. The idea is this is a social kind of centre which brings together very disparate groups of the community, so young and old, different kind of racial groups and so on, into something which is collective. So reflecting back the circumstances of the place, so here the nature and industry, for example, so there's polystyrene trees that are sprayed with gold polyurethane, the most unnatural way of making trees, for example. Or the way in which the facade is cut, essentially into a super graphic which tells the story of the town. As a way of, let's say, taking a current situation and projecting it into the future. So this becomes a kind of vision of what this synthesis of the disparate parts of the community could become. So the decorative here is, in a sense, useful. It's useful in the way that it engages the kind of context and the society that it's working within and working for.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam. Okay, thank you very much to our three panelists for those great talks. It seems to me that, and this is something every panel chair likes to see, it looks like we have the good ingredients for an argument on our hands. And particularly, I'm struck by what seems to be a great disparity between Charles's presentation and Grayson's. Charles's being littered with learned quotations and allusions, and also standing up for, I think, in some ways, a kind of classic suspicion of dishonest kitsch and the upholding of an intelligent use of kitsch in juxtaposition to that, or perhaps you would say an intelligent use of decoration and a complete repudiation of kitsch. Grayson, you seem to be very happy to embrace kitsch wholeheartedly, and you have a great and abiding love for it, which I think is infectious. And Sam, you seem to be occupying another terrain which wants to be mobile in relation to kitsch and perhaps quote it, appropriate it in some of the ways that perhaps Charles is describing figures like Charles Moore and Sterling as having done. And I do want to talk about that terrain, but I first want to go back to something you said, Grayson, which was actually very poignant for me as somebody who I suppose is a professional understander of things, curator, writer, historian. And you talked about the loneliness of that position, which I can identify with. And I think that there's something that cuts right to the core in that idea about standing outside of something that seems to be authentic, vernacular, true, honest, gutsy, expressive, real. And ornament seems to stand for that thing often. And as you see it in the half timbering that you talked about, you see it in the Italian community, that you talked about Charles Moore's relationship to that. You see it perhaps, Grayson, even in your touring of various sites around Europe and your selective aesthetic choices and a kind of yearning for that. It seems like a kind of desire to overcome loneliness. And so I thought it might be a good idea to start from a very individual position rather than going into the direction of high theory immediately, and ask you each to talk about what your personal relationship to ornament is and what its use for you is, I want to say emotionally, rather than professionally.
Can I say that, first of all, I think that decoration and ornament are different, and it has to do with class, and the whole class question is sort of simmering in this whole discussion, and we could open that Pandora's box and spend a lot of time on it.
Oh, please.
Okay. Let's do that. But let's also agree that it is the greatest. I think ornament needs multiple juxtapositions. Not just the community, not just communication, not just function, not just all the stuff you can list. And I agree with Grayson entirely that the quote, function of ornament and decoration, too, for that matter, is music and enjoyment. Honestly, it was, of course, in the 19th century when the function of ornament was written by, Owen Jones and others, that they admitted music. And my old teacher, Gombrich, his last book was on the sense of order, about ornament and music. And music is a superior form of being, in a way, and it's ornamental. You can't use it to sit on, music. And, it is, I think fundamentally we're not, even in spite of Glenn trying to put wedges between us, we're actually...
Or air gaps, as you might call it.
Air gap. But if we want to discuss class, I think, I was reminded in your talk of the phrase, was it Osbert Lancaster, ghastly good taste, or was it John Betjeman? Anyway, in the 30s, the class thing came out with modernism, and they went after Herr Dr. Pesner, the German, grand theorist of Englishness of English taste. And they hated modernism at that time, and they used a kind of upper class, aristocratic, and working class to attack the professionalization of the middle class and modern architects. And I think, of course, no one really listened to them, and the modernist won, and the profession won. And I agree with Grayson. If you, as I do, go all the time to architecture competitions and see the profession at its public thing, it's never a person is in it. There's only one taste, and it is frigid, it is timid, it is ghastly good taste, and it's a professional nightmare we suffer from. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I could even see the hints of it in both your shows. Both of your things you were talking about, the way that you almost distanced yourself from the decorative elements. Formally, in the building, you put in things, and you had to justify the decoration formally. Like, oh, I do know that what this is. You couldn't sort of wholeheartedly, authentically be behind it and say, yeah, I just want colour and pattern and blah, blah, blah. It had to be like, oh, yes, I'm making a reference to colour and pattern, or like a quotation, and if you look very carefully and you know about architecture, you can see that I don't really mean it completely wholeheartedly like you think I do. I'm being incredibly clever by referencing it or distancing myself from it and not just being it.
Yes, Sam, I was very struck by your image of thought bubbles coming up from these vernacular touches in this front yard, which I guess is a kind of quotation of Venturi and Scott Brown's Signs of Life. Yeah, they did something very similar in the 1970s. Where they did this kind of speech bubbles of picket fences. This is what this thing says, this is what this thing says. But that really is that meta position that you're describing. It's not doing the thing, it's sort of thinking about the thing, but it seems to me that contained in that thinking is a desire to do it, really, but almost an inability.
I think it goes back to your thing about being I think there's a loneliness of the middle classness, and it's like almost like being so educated that you've almost got this internal CCTV the whole time. That is looking at yourself doing the stuff.
I want to ask Sam for what he thinks about that.
I'd say that there's a difference that you have in the way in which you're employed as an architect is you have to have this kind of way of looking at things. You can't express yourself in that way, even though you may be secretly thinking it. The kind of the strategic, the professional, the way in which you have to present it, the kinds of people that you have to present it to, I think gives it that sort of distance. Yet, actually, it's about making a crazy thing out of concrete.
But is that not then a tragedy to try to get over that kind of professionalism?
I'm not so sure.
Timidity?
For me, I think it's. I don't see any problem with looking at it from both sides to say it is actually a serious matter of intellectual kind of concern.
Yeah.
That it also is all of those things that critics would be interested in, as well as just a thing that you want to do. And I think, of course, it is both those things. One is the expression, one is the object itself, but the other is how that object performs in the world. And I certainly think in architecture that you have to not only justify it in a professional way, you have to take a position against the kind of backdrop that Charles was talking about, against architecture's own idea of itself. You have to make an argument. It has to be a polemic.
So returning to our question about what is the use of ornament now, or at any time, I suppose, but now is one we care about. Perhaps one suggestion I might make is that if we're thinking about these two positions, let's say loneliness, the loneliness of knowing too much and being unable to do, on the other hand, the immediacy of doing it without having that CCTV camera on, perhaps one thing that ornament is useful for is actually providing the link between those two positions and everything in between them, because it is so mobile. You kind of stick it on a building like you're putting a sticker on on a musical instrument case, right? It's there, and it's often cheap, especially in the days of computer generation. Very much different from the Bavarian church that you showed, Grayson. Now you can run off ornament by the yard, and it's no more expensive or less expensive than modernism. It's the same price, and so it is a free choice. And I wonder
still
what
a
you
bit
think about
add-on,
that
though.
fluidity. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that's what I worry about, is that it's still a little bit add-on. Still, it's boxes with bits stuck on. And I kind of worry about it, I'd like it to be in the idea of pleasure in it being in it from the beginning more.
But that sounds quite modernist, because you're objecting to those color blobs, and now you seem to be saying that that kind of applied technique, which you were also objecting to in Philip Johnson's AT&T building, Charles, is itself objectionable.
I think there is a problem, and the problem is of lost innocence, and I think there's sort of a heroic attempt of Grayson to lose his innocence, or to regain it, I should say. So loneliness may be something we should talk about, but if you accept that, the thing about ornament and decoration is, since it's an added extra, it can make buildings much cheaper and much more enjoyable. Cheaper, because, as they said in the 19th century, ornament always hides a fault in construction, and so it should. In other words, there are all sorts of problems in construction, which if you ornament them, go away, and they're much cheaper. So I think there's something else. It's a philosophical thing. I just think, why can't we have high culture of ornament that is, worked out in 10 different ways with 10 different justifications, because it's more interesting. Why? You can't be against that, really, Grayson. You can't disallow it for the people that want it.
Oh, no, and I think, I've got nothing against minimalism if it's done well. Sometimes I get fed up of it. It's posited as a kind of a pure thing, and it has the moral high ground. And I want to say, no, it's just another style. And if you scrape a minimalist, they're just as emotionally engaged with minimalism as somebody who's really into ornate decorative things. It's no different. It's just another style. But don't make it out that that's the pure form.
No, but D. Vries, the Wise Church, which you love and I love, was created for a community, and it understood these incredibly esoteric ideas of Christ and the Passion and all that blood and guts, and was very much brought into the architecture. And if you and I are tourists there in a sense, because we don't understand that background. But why can't we grant that a lot of ornament can grow in a high culture as well as on the shop floor? In other words, I don't think we want to make noble savages out of any position for ornament. Or that's why. Let me just say that with who was Ornament and Crime? Adolf Loos. If you read Adolf Loos's Ornament and Crime, I can't read that without laughing. It's a completely funny piece of writing, which unfortunately the Bauhaus and Corbusier took seriously. But really, it's crazy. It's catatonic. He says, you don't need ornament because you have Beethoven. Only degenerate aristocrats ornament them, or go and end in prison. It's really hysterical. It's a neo-hysterical rationalism. So I'm thinking all the time, that how reason, the rational brain, okay, it may be overdone in modernism, but I don't want to not have it. Rational. It was Raquel Welch who said the sexiest organ of the male body is the brain.
Yeah, but the brain is also where the feelings are.
Yeah, okay.
But the example that you showed, Grayson, of Neuschwanstein, he's amazing, Ludwig II.
Ludwig.
He's the loneliest guy
Yeah,
but
that
that's
ever existed.
Well,
right?
he was a recluse, and he couldn't handle the world.
Can we talk about communication a bit? and I'm thinking again about your half timbering example, Sam, because it strikes me that there is again a kind of problem built into decoration if what we're hoping it will give us is a means of communicating easily to people who will never meet, right? So you stick it on a building or a painting or a pot, indeed. We're talking a lot about architecture, but again, it's objects, it's art, it's everything. And because it's denotative and it sort of signals something to you like oldness, or maybe English oldness in the case of half timbering, it works really well. But the problem with that kind of recognition is that it almost has to be divorced from some sense of originality, right?
Maybe in its early days, it wasn't so concerned with history, but certainly by the time it gets to AT&T, it has to be history that's figured through its decoration. And I think that is interesting, that idea of high and low becomes a kind of caricature, like the shed versus the temple, or Rome versus Las Vegas, for example. But all of those things which in maybe the mid-70s are kind of juxtapositions which do something. By the mid-80s, that's played out. But endlessly using those historical references, I think, is where you see postmodernism running into sand, I think. Whether the decorative has to do that, I mean, I think certainly in the ways in which we work, its references may be familiar, but the ways in which they're used perhaps are not, but also what they combine. So if you think of this mobility, that the fact that it's drawing on all kinds of references, that kind of soup that you generate comes from whatever the circumstances may be of site or client or scenario, and that in itself can generate forms of decoration which are different. It essentially becomes a kind of graphic technique or material technique whose concerns are not necessarily high and low, Rome and Las Vegas. The clarity of that position as set out in postmodernism has kind of disappeared, probably because those relationships don't work anymore. Like, it's become a much flatter cultural landscape.
Grayson, you seem to be a figure who's right in the sort of coalface of that breakdown and flatness in some ways. I mean, what you said about taxi driver appeal, I thought was very interesting, because you seem to be implying that decoration would be a way to reach a taxi driver, and I wanted to press you on that point.
I think what it is like, no, it's man hours, and it's kind of something that is immediately appealing in terms of its, without understanding what the symbols mean or anything. It's just, like I was questioning somebody the other day about their tattoos, and they gave me this long diatribe about what their tattoos meant. And I thought, no, you just wanted wiggly lines on your arms like everybody else did. That's why people have tattoos on the whole. They want to look like a person with tattoos.
Right.
And so, and so I'm not, I could. I mean, of course, Charles, I agree with Charles in that, I want the rational arguments just as much as the irrational arguments for decoration. But I'm trying to make a polemic here for the sake of the audience. And where was I? We were talking about the taxi driver appeal. And I mean, I think that there has been, going back to class, I suppose, is that we think of kitsch and ornateness, and the working classes, they just don't know when to stop, and they will always have more. They won't, because restraint seems to be the thread that I see through kind of taste and class. And often having restraint, I mean, somebody once said in fashion, elegance is denial. And I think that idea that if you just sort of let it go and you pile on the fake tan, and you pile on the false eyelashes, and you pile on jewellery and bling and whatever, that you haven't got any taste. It's just a different sort of taste. It's just they like that sort of taste. Maybe in their culture, in their society, that's what they like. And there's good and bad within it. And there's modernists who have good and bad modernism. Christ almighty, we've seen a lot of bad sort of neo-superficial modernism in the last few years. Sort of like the kind of it used to be that everybody who bought a new house wanted it to look like a country cottage or a stately home. Now they all seem to want it to look like a loft or something, and a loft that has a ceiling that would brush your hair gel off,
So Charles, you've had this long career of standing up for that principle of difference that Grayson's talking about. I mean, that in a way is what you think postmodernism is for, and perhaps decoration is for, is articulating difference. But you also want to cut some lines in the ground and say, this is bad, this is good,
Yeah,
which you did in your talk. How do you think about, let's say, the taxi driver problem, if we could call it that, which I think we want to note
Yeah,
the class
right. No,
condescension in that
yeah.
example too.
sure.
You know, it's got
Yeah.
a big problem in the heart of it, that
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah.
How do you situate your embrace of difference in relation to that problem?
Right. Well, first of all, you know, when the taste question was raised as a political one in the 60s, when Herbert Gans wrote Urban Villagers and then the Venturi Scott Browns took it over, and I took it over, the notion that there's seven, sorry to be pedantic about it, 7 taste cultures between high culture at the top and I can't remember what the seventh, the great
Why
unwashed.
7? Why not 7 million?
7 million. Well, geodemographics did that 10 years later. But, I mean, you can keep dividing and subdividing taste cultures. But the notion of taste culture and its relation to class and politics was theorized in the 60s by Herbert Gans. It said the thing about upper class taste culture and modernist taste culture, and if you go through those taste cultures, is that they have the power. They have the Museum of Modern Art. They have, you know, the advertisements. They have Madison Avenue. They are imposing their taste in modern architecture. And the CBS building was the classic case where Eero Saarinen designed the ultimate good taste skyscraper. It was a beautiful, beautiful building. And every night, the cleaners would come through with Saarinen's plan, and they would rearrange the potted plants and the ashtray, and they would strip it down to minimalist, Knoll International, modernist interiors. This was a form of active nightly repression on the secretaries, who weren't even allowed to have their husband's photograph when they typed. Whereas the owner of CBS had a half-timbered Tudor room at the top. He had the whole penthouse in half-timber Tudor and pictures of all his kids in undress. Anyway, so it was, all right.
There's an opposite of that. Cath Kidston apparently has got a glass box kitchen. So it works both ways.
It works both ways. Sure, okay, but
It's the portability of ornament again.
there's a political, you know, to answer you, I think that there are, you know, better and worse versions of these different kinds of ornamental and decorative programs. And ghastly good taste is probably the lowest rung of hell for me. I agree with the taste culture view. First of all, we're all pluralists at this table, I'm pretty sure. And so we don't suffer from the modernist repression. But there is a problem of kitsch and mass culture, which doesn't start with Hitler, Stalin, and so forth. And in the 30s, as Clement Greenberg, remember, Clement Greenberg very clearly draws the line, and that line was redrawn again and again by critics in architecture. So it has been used repressively. But at the same time, Greenberg was focusing on a truth of fascism, totalitarianism, and the way, not since the 30s, since the Romans and even the Egyptians had mass culture kitsch. And kitsch can be used in the way that Greenberg is talking, to tribalize masses of people if you have, you know, Gaddafi behind it. I knew people, architectural critics, who went to Gaddafi, by the way, who were invited by him to give them a day's seminar on the classical style in 1981. I know John O'Neill, if you want to look him up and ask him. So don't think kitsch is only, you know, a modernist diatribe. It is, you know, the books on kitsch, it is used to brutalize people, and it is accepted often by brutalized people. So there is a problem here. I just don't think we can say there isn't a problem. But it's only one of many problems.
Can modernism become kitsch, though?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it can.
Oh,
I think there's a
right,
lot
right,
of kind of,
yeah.
there's almost minimalist kitsch around.
Yes, yes. Here, here.
Yeah.
These things do flip. So if you think of the tattoo and the Adolf Loos figure in the tattoo as the criminal, the degenerate, and you think of like the ultimate kind of modern object of, you know, David Beckham, for example, and his tattoos, which become kind of good taste now. So that these things can, it's not contained within themselves, it's the way in which they position themselves within the culture. So in exactly the same way, modernism can be appallingly kitsch.
It's a default mode, I think, of so many designers and architects. That's the sad thing. When you're frightened and you don't know what to do, default.
Can I just pick up another gauntlet that Grayson threw down, and then I want to open the floor to questions. So if you have any, do please ask, and I hope we have some taxi drivers among you. But I just want to ask one last question.
Trev's
Well,
on there.
I just want to ask one last question, so because I think it's extremely important, and I too regret the fact that we don't have the kind of diversity, both gender and ethnic and professional, and probably even class, that we might on this panel. It's an ever-present problem, obviously, in putting panels together of any kind. But I think in particular with this case, we have this question of gender which looms in the history of this question. And I think it's important to note that in addition to the architectural discourse and the discourse about the vernacular and the kind of fine art discourse, there's an incredibly important story about feminist theory of ornament. And briefly, that has to do with the decorative being a viable form of expression of exactly the kind that we've all been describing as, you know, in the most laudatory terms, as something that was completely despised, overlooked, often literally behind closed doors within private space, and something that had to be reclaimed with great force, perhaps first by the suffragettes at the turn of the century, then very famously by feminist artists in the 1970s, Miriam Shapiro, Joyce Kozloff, Judy Chicago. And that, to me, seems to be, as you've often argued, Charles, a very important strand of postmodernism, or kind of intertwining series of thoughts that relate to postmodernism very powerfully, but also as a very key precedent for what's happening now. And insofar as we now have many waves of feminism after the suffragettes in the 1970s politicization, I wonder what you all think as observers about questions of gender equality, questions of gender articulation, and the way that decoration could still serve to speak to those or not. Do you think that's become a dead letter? Or do you think that it's still an important way of speaking to gender roles and the obvious fact that we still don't have anything approaching gender equality in our culture?
Oh God, I wouldn't presume to be able to speak about that. I mean, I am a man in a dress. I make up the thing. I mean, I suppose the only thing I could punt out, and this is but just a complete sort of bit of waffle that I've just come up with in the moment, is that my experience of sort of gender roles is that the male is as a child is encouraged to do stuff, have a function, so therefore it tends to prioritise that. Whereas the female is perhaps more to sort of knocked into the idea of being, and therefore being looked at. So therefore that kind of might skew the idea that men put this priority on function, whatever that be. And I don't know, that was just, you know, a feeling.
Decoration traditionally is the useless thing.
Yeah, that decoration is just looking good is not a good thing in itself. It's somehow, again, my very existence for some people, it feels like, you know.
I agree with both of you.
Okay, let's turn to the audience then. We had a question here.
It's not really a question, is it? Just
Do wait for the mic, actually, because we're recording this.
It's just an observation about the value of ornament, because I always think the who question and the technology question and the market question. And 18th century ornament was expensive. If you were poor, you didn't have any. 19th century ornament grew increasingly cheap. And so you listen to William Morris, what he's going on about is clearly not ornament, but poor people's ornament. He's going on about machine carving, the inauthenticity of machine carving, or the oleograph, or all those tuppence-coloured things that people like Betchman thought were marvellous, nearly 100 years later. But it became commoditized. Poor people could have a riot of stuff, and then by the early 20th century they could have a better riot of stuff. And that's what lies behind the condemnation of ornament, that it's accessible. It's very accessible. It's as cheap to make a thing ornamented as not. But credit where due to Tom Wolfe here. Nobody's mentioned Bauhaus to Our House or the Painted Word, which goes through the whole thing of Clement Greenberg and his role in life.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point we alluded to.
Oh, and another thing.
Yes?
And another thing. When you get the ghost of habitat, the ghost of dead habitat on all those, that man who made sort of Todd Bunchy or whatever, that sort of wibbly-wobbly computer-accessed ornament. So it isn't even proper postmodern, nice proper postmodern. It's, I'm at a distance compounded by another distance, making this sort of chiclet, terrible ornament that's much, much more horrible than having full-on, down market ornament.
I mean, I think you're right about this sort of. One thing I've sort of noticed is this sort of vestigial swirl that building. What was the building you showed?
The FOA building.
Is it
John Lewis FOA?
the John Lewis building with all the swirls over it? That reminds me of the sort of swirl. There was a picture of Nigella Lawson coming out the surf in a burkini, and to show that it was a feminine garment, it had like a swirl on it. And if you look at sort of some brands of sanitary pads now, they have like a swirl on them. And then there was the kind of royal wedding coverage on the telly. It has a swirl on it. It's like the last pared down little vestigial signal of, oh, we're in feminine territory here. It's like this is decoration boiled down to a pictograph that stands for the entire history of decoration. And it's like, tosh. I just want to scream whenever I see you'll see it everywhere now, the vestigial little swirl. And it always says, ooh, feminine time. And it's like, fuck off.
Amen. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah. As we're sort of looking at the idea of taste as a moral code, the idea or the phrase of the night that kind of had jumped out for me was, Charles, when you were railing against one building or another and saying, it doesn't do this, it doesn't do this, it doesn't raise your consciousness, it doesn't.
Only the AT&T, I said that.
Okay, so then that was the one.
Right.
Probably nobody on the stage really believes that the decorative arts are necessarily low arts, but if we were to try to understand what that argument might really be about, certainly, Grayson, your idea about use and that being somehow an imperative that things have to be useful, and so that if they're only pretty, they're less good. I wonder could we say that for this lonely intellectual position that we've been talking about, the imperative is, does it make you think? Is it good for you? Does it raise our consciousness? And if it doesn't, is it then somehow dirty and low and pretty?
Yeah. So the question, I suppose, would be one about the ethical weight of the decorative and the lack of ethical weight of the decorative. So it's easily swept up into, Nazism by Albert Speer. It can be made to apply to any kind of power structure that you want it to, and therefore it seems worryingly non-critical, worryingly non-intellectual, and it does have a problem with maintaining a strong ethical compass. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah, great question. Anyone have thoughts on that?
Well, I think the 19th century confusion between style and ethics is legion, and you're right to talk about the lower arts, because there's a hierarchy of 17 arts, both in the West and in China, and craftsmanship still is fairly near the lowest, and decorative commodified clip-ons is, as far as the modernists are concerned, is the lowest of the low. So there is a hierarchy, and people carry it around in their head, whether they like to think of it or not. I think the difficulty here is that the class argument, the moral argument, which I think is mostly phony, frankly, is also getting confused with the aesthetic one, because I do think, for instance, that although Grayson's been, I understand why he doesn't like curlicued FOA thing. It's a masterful example of a rotational ornament used in amazingly different ways. I only showed one slide of it. The fact that the particular ornament is a 19th century example of lace from Leicester, because the building's in Leicester, is really not too important. What's really important is how it's used in the building. I didn't explain that, but it's used so that people can undress and dress and not be seen and be seen, and it's selling clothes, and it's used in an incredibly funny and lighthearted way, as well as a marvelous rotational way that pushes technology and production much further.
But
than they
Charles,
have been.
just to push you on that,
Yeah.
because the question is really about the ethical.
But I think the ethical one is
But that's not-
usually
I mean, here you have a corporation.
is confused. I mean, the modernists believe truth to materials and things which are always only themselves, that is monosemantic, is ethical. And I think, that's so banal and super stupid argument that the woodiness of wood, the brickiness of brick, and the steeliness of steel, and you can only use one material and one structure, is a kind of dead moralism. It is moralism, it's not morality. So, I don't buy this. I think morality is much more of an active verb, and, it's in how design is in action. Who you're doing it for, what's it for?
But I would say that, although it's easy to castigate the modernist ethical position as simplistic, and I think we all agree on that, I think it would be a lot harder to stand up for that FOA building as being ethical, frankly. I mean, it might be clever and complex.
Why? I mean, if you
but-
accept that we should shop at a John Lewis store, it's building use. You have to accept is what everybody's doing on Google every minute of the day. And I don't like the moralism that says shopping centers are bad. I mean, this one is in the city. I mean, that's what I mean. It actually revives Leicester. It doesn't. It's not a suburban shopping center, so it doesn't destroy the city, and it makes a lot of urban moves. So, I think you look at the particular case, and then you decide the morality is in the doing of the particular.
Okay. Last question, or maybe two more if we have time.
Yes.
I was interested in what you were saying about the taxi driver wanting something more ornamented, because there's a famous TV moment where a TV DIY program in the 50s, 60s takes a 4-panelled Edwardian Victorian door and puts a piece of hardboard on it and instantly creates something that is dust-free, easy to live with. There's a moment in time post-war where everyone's ripping everything off the inside of buildings, all the cornices, all the skirtings, and making it much more modern. And that was ordinary people, and that was kind of, bringing it down to the bottom level of what the ordinary person wanted. They didn't want to be spending time with the woman discovering feminism and going out to work to be dusting. And actually the ornament was dragging them down, that they didn't have time for ornament because life was too short.
Interestingly, that actually is Adolf Loos's argument. He uses the example of a shoemaker who's constantly putting holes in the shoes when he should be going out and having life, which I think actually is quite a persuasive argument on some level. So what do you think about the idea of ornament as a trap? This sounds to me like that's something you're suggesting, that it's something that contains you.
I think it's a
Keeps you from thinking
baloney
otherwise.
generator. I mean, I think in the modern life, you can have a very ornamental house that's very easy to keep clean, and you can have a minimalist house. I mean, have you tried to keep your stainless steel kitchen clean? All that glass, it shows every little speck. A minimalist house, tidying up a minimalist house is one of the nightmares in the world. So I don't think that argument about, I think that there's room for everything. And, if you like ornament and fiddliness or whatever, fine. If you like a lovely minimalist, beautiful materials, great. One is not morally more superior than the other. One might be a lot more expensive.
But I think
Or not.
that's certainly a kind of a reduced form of the sort of ideological position that modernism took, which is nothing to do with the object itself. Like you can clean this or you can clean that, but it's to do with the kind of morality that's associated, or the kind of politics or the ideology that's associated with an aesthetic. And those things are not intrinsically linked. They're kind of glued together in a way which seems useful, I think, for whoever's making that argument. But I think in terms of that issue about the sort of moral code, it's the interesting thing is it allows you to see what's regarded as right and wrong. And so I think that analysis of the visual, of taste, allows you to see an ideology which you can't see otherwise. That in the visual language of Habitat or the visual language of IKEA, we can begin to understand what it is the modern world really is, and how that's articulated into objects, and how, for example, the taste of the working class, for example, seems to have changed or democratized in a way that it is all IKEA now. But understanding that now is a kind of it is right, and that some other approach might be wrong, I think is important. So I'm not necessarily so pluralistic. I don't necessarily think it's okay for everyone to have a modernist kitchen or a kind of rustic kitchen. I think that all of those positions need to be in some ways challenged, maybe equally challenged. I don't think it's necessarily about people enjoying themselves, but I think there is a role within architecture and design of trying to expose the kind of...
I think people choose the sort of amount or the lack of decoration they want to fit in with the tribe that they want to fit in. So they kind of, depending on what tribe, you want to put out the signals that kind of make you a good person within your tribe. So if your tribe has minimalist kitchens, you will buy the nicest minimalist kitchen. If your tribe has lots of decorative china, then you buy lots of decorative china. It's about fitting in with your tribe and being seen as a good person within your tribe. It's not a kind of, it's not a whole society-wide thing. You know, taste and that is in bubbles.
Well, it is and isn't though, Grayson, because some tribes have more power than other tribes, and sometimes style wars are more important or less important. In the countryside, you know, certain kinds of styles dominate, and Prince Charles is very much part of that. In the cities, other tribes dominate. And so there are style wars that always, you know, not only self-defining, but represent powers. And they become built into building codes, and architects are always trying to have more control over that diminishing amount of construction. I mean, they say that in the past, up to 1900, 90% of the houses were self-built. And now maybe, if you take the whole global production system, 5% is designed by architects. But in Britain, 40% of the buildings put up are at least architect signed or influenced. So all of these things have something to do with not only tribes, but which tribes have the power and how designers are always trying to grab more power because they have so little. It's understandable that we may get so angry in these style wars, but you know, they don't really have much to do. I think we're in agreement on the tribes. They don't have too much to do with morality, unless you're trying, as Herbert Gans was, to you know, give the great unwashed, and Bannon was trying to do it, and I think you two, in a way, are trying to authenticate taste culture, which is usually is repressed in our mainstream country culture and our city culture, both in modernism and in the countryside. You know, both of your work would be sometimes dismissed as bad taste. I'm not saying it always, but it might, and it may delight you that it is so, and get you more jobs with a few clients. But it may also anger you and make you leave town or the city or the country. So, I don't know.
Okay, I think, unfortunately, although I feel we could talk about this for quite a while longer, I think we do need to draw to a close. It strikes me that we've, you know, since we're all in the same room, we're kind of a tribe anyway, aren't we?
Oh, aren't we? This is really a tribe. This
Yeah,
is the North
absolutely.
London chattering classes.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So, you know, all lonely, exactly. So you know, perhaps if we've learned anything, we hopefully have learned a lot about ourselves as a tribe, but one thing that I'll take away from this conversation is this idea of ornament as something that perhaps can break through these boxes, even if it's only in a provisional, uncomplicated, and problematic way. At least this gives us the possibility or the means to even talk about these kinds of issues. And I think we have talked a lot about power, class, gender, place, these things that divide us, and hopefully ornament is a way of having a discussion that maybe doesn't involve intellectual communication, but other forms as well, across those dividing lines. So with that, I will ask you to help me thank the panelists, and thank you all very much for coming.